Welcome back to Acid Horizon. Today's episode features an extended patrons exclusive portion of the discussion as a thank you for your ongoing support of the podcast and everything we've been building around it. If you've been on the fence about subscribing, this is your moment. The Patreon exclusive for this episode comes with some additional freebies as well. As many of you know, we've been expanding our para-academic platform, Acid Horizon Research Commons, with the teachers and students in mind. The AHRC is a space where instructors are paid and recognized for their work, while we keep access to course recordings free or low cost. If you'd like to browse our archive or are in a bit of a financial pinch at the moment, we have 5 free 1-month subscriptions to the archive waiting in that post. For those in a position to support AHRC, its teachers, and its staff more directly, we have monthly and yearly subscription options available in the same place. We also have 3 courses left in our summer series. And for this week only, we've lowered the threshold for entry to all of them. The AHRC mini bundle brings together Tyreek MacGeorge on Fanon's dialectical philosophy, Devin Goray on Nietzsche, Bataille, and the aesthetics of liberation, and Emma Stam on anti-civilization, all at over 50% off the combined original price. This offer expires on June 19th, so if you're listening the week that this drops, you need to hurry. To access all of this, head to the exclusive Patreon post, which also unlocks the extended portion of today's conversation. Now, let's head on over to Adam and Emma, where we discuss the Pope's recent encyclical launch, the staging of capital as divine authority, and what it means when Anthropic gets a seat at the Vatican table. Let's listen.
The bar is in hell. Like, Elon Musk became a trillionaire today. Like, 3 years of ongoing genocide and just rising fascism no one knows how to stop, apart from the obvious way, of course. And so we have to look for moral leadership from the Pope. Now, just to be fair, it is technically his job. But I even did, like, I've seen like loads of these memes about, like, you know, like, the Pope being like starting the Butlerian jihad. So I was like, okay, naturally I have to, read this as someone who writes stuff about, AI as a form of class warfare. And I was just reading it and I'm like, 500,000 German peasants didn't die 500 years ago for us to go say that the Pope was doing the Butlerian jihad. He's not doing the Butlerian jihad. And that's a very silly reference, but I was just sort of like, I was like Karl Marx and Max Stirner, like nailing feces on Feuerbach to the door of St. Peter's Basilica reading this.
I have to say that I was just deeply disappointed in the reading. And of course, we're talking about the encyclical, if I haven't mentioned that in the intro.
Magnifica, Humanitas.
Yeah, that's my reminder to put that in the intro. I don't know what I was expecting, to be honest, because you often hear on just quasi-liberal outlets like, oh, the Pope made quite a radical statement today about AI or something. And I'll just hear that and it'll go in one ear, not necessarily out the other, but it'll find its way into my craw and just kind of nest there. And I'll never really check it out. And so this time, because of you, Adam, you made me check it out. You made us check it out. And I'm actually glad that we did, because it reaffirmed many of my political commitments. Like, this is a way to kind of sort of re-radicalize myself. And Emma is here with us too. So Emma, I don't know if you have a couple things that you want to say about your reading of the encyclical.
Well, off the bat, I don't know if either of you have caught wind of this, but I've seen a talking point among, I think it's mostly Gen Z online, where they're saying that there's no difference between being on the left and being a liberal. And I kind of enjoy this document as a way for us to reassert that there is a meaningful difference there, because a lot of it was pretty hard to swallow.
Huge litmus test.
Yeah, and I find it interesting, particularly when it comes to sort of various online discourses, imaginations of of what the Pope is, because, or who the Pope is, I guess, because he has that whole joke about, one of the most cliche things about statements of identity is, is the Pope Catholic? Yes. But the problem is that if you're on like the American right, especially if you are a Catholic, you tend to think that the Pope isn't a Catholic, he's a communist, because there's so few statements that are allowed to be put into the world, into the media, that are explicitly critical of the economic regime around AI, or to criticize the hype around AI at all. A lot of people see this kind of thing coming out from the Pope, and then they go, my God, he must be the exact type of communist I am. If anything, this document is a good way for us to sort of reaffirm. And it's quite weird for a Deleuzean sort of podcast to talk about identity markers in this way, but we found an actual case of identity. The Pope is in fact Catholic. He is not either a communist you don't want him to be or the communist you want him to be. I think that I don't think we're going to be sort of too surprised by this other than saying, what did we expect? It's both less straightforwardly capitalist as you can be when you've had 2,000 years of mediation, and then
mediation that's putting it lightly.
Mediation. Well, I mean, I think mediation is something you have to have when, because this piece has a lot about dialogue in it and about words and debate and evolving traditions. And I'm like, yeah, I know you have to have an evolving tradition when you can no longer burn all of your critics at the stake. That's something you just have to have, like at Peace of Westphalia, 30 Years War, Lateran Treaty, which gave the Vatican back its remaining temporal powers, signed with Mussolini. This is very much a piece that's like post the time when the Vatican had like temporal power, back before the Pope was like a real like political monarch, whereas now he's kind of like it's moving towards this non-interventionist, overlapping moral direction. I mean, it's not entirely convincing, but that's at least how it's trying to frame itself.
I was reading about encyclicals and trying to put this in context as somebody who doesn't feel conversant, let's say, with Catholicism. And it really stuck out to me that they made this point, and the Pope's pronouns, definitely not they. He made this point that the church needs to be involved in worldly affairs, and there's sort of going to what I felt was an excessive justification even for the existence of this document. And then reading about encyclicals, kind of really internalizing that it's an ongoing conversation, I suppose, within and around Catholicism, the degree to which it should be intervening in the concrete world, the world of society and mundane affairs. And it is kind of a strange thing to think about coming from the perspective of somebody who really wasn't raised with any of this and still feels very much on the outside of it, even as I try to learn about it for scholarly reasons, that there was this underlying sense to me that would this exist if they didn't have some sort of almost a guilt that comes from something that doesn't necessarily follow naturally from the doctrine, if that makes sense. Sort of like, we kind of have to deal with this, not because of anything that's, let's say, Catholic or Christian in principle, but almost to stay current, just because, unfortunately, now we have this age of industry and progress that perhaps if the Enlightenment hadn't happened, then it wouldn't be interfacing with the world, or the Pope and the Catholic Church wouldn't be interfacing with the world in this way.
I don't know if I'll keep this in the recording, but Emma, I thought you had some Catholic in your background.
Oh yeah, I mean we can for my own purposes we can keep this in the recording. It's not a secret. My mother was raised as a Catholic and actually had a very, very strict upbringing, British Catholic boarding school in the early 60s. So she rebelled against that later in life and did not raise me as a Catholic. But I think if you are instilled with that early in life, it kind of never leaves you. So kind of just by osmosis and everything being very implicit. Maybe I've got some Catholic bouncing around in my psyche, but I don't know a lot of the grammar and syntax, shall we say.
Yeah, we're going to do a little bit of standpoint theory on today's show because this is the one time that I can announce my participation in the Catholic identity. So yeah, I was born and raised Catholic, but actually split Catholic Protestant family. My father wasn't very religious or isn't very religious. My mother is a little bit more. She has a bit of a relationship with the church and the mass and so forth. So I think, anyway, I think that's still how things are. But yeah, I was baptized, Holy Communion, confirmation, the whole 9 yards, all the smells and bells. But, with all that said, I don't think any of the criticisms that I'll make today necessarily require me to be Catholic. Although I will say that there is always this lingering sense of, despite the fact that I have disavowed it, I would say the technology of the smells and bells of the Mass and the church itself still infuses itself in my perception of what the church is or even could be. When I walk into a Catholic church, I see something that's utterly beautiful. And the iconography and everything, it works. It has a hold on my psyche still, somewhat, despite all of the excesses that I see. It's really hard for me to take the Catholic Church seriously in terms of things that happened between my family and the church when I was younger, after the time that I was confirmed. But not only that, just the sheer fact that they cannot take care of their own house and make these proclamations about what's happening in the world with AI. And not much has changed with respect to the kinds of political statements that they've been making over the past 125 years or thereabouts, because this particular encyclical has the same sort of tone and political affect, if you will, of the Rerum Novarum, the appearance of new things, the world reaching a veritable height or midpoint in modernity. I think it was, Adam, and correct me if I'm wrong here, it was like 1891 when the Pope did that encyclical. And that largely, a big part of that had to do with the excesses of labor and the rise of manufacturing, the Western industrial productive edifice and so forth, and human rights surrounding labor. And also, it was an anti-communist document in its own way. We can get more into that later. But with that said, I don't know. I'll let Adam have a go at his relationship to Catholicism.
Oh, I don't have any. Like the relationship to Catholicism, particularly of someone as my sort of English and Welsh background, was kind of set during the Tudor period because Henry VIII wanted to get divorced, and therefore, that never really happened. And I was never raised in these sort of religious contexts either. We don't really believe in God in England. We believe in rent and various other evil things. You wouldn't think that there was a God if you lived here, to be honest. I mean, it does prove the existence of Satan, however. So, there's a kind of a weird double bind here. But just thinking about Rerum Novarum, it means new things, like re is Latin for thing, the Rerum Novarum, like thinking about Lucretius's book titled De Rerum Natura, on the way of things, nature of things. And it's in this 1891 encyclical by Pope Leo XIII. This Pope is Pope Leo XIV. He's gearing himself up. And it's sort of the papal response to the Industrial Revolution, essentially laying out the basics of what Pope Leo XIV is talking about today with Catholic social teaching. This idea of the sort of mediating factor between capital and labor, where it's like private property is good, but not an absolute good, because it must be used for the common good. I mean, I made sort of a note of the principles because Leo XIV goes over the main principles here of social doctrine in the Catholic Church. I think it might be good just to list them. So these principles are, I'll go back to them in terms of their importance for our discussion today. So the first one I'm going to talk about is social justice, which is essentially everybody gets to live a dignified life without leaving anyone behind. Let's park the term dignity there for a second, because that's the most interesting thing to talk about philosophically. It's solidarity, so everyone's dignity and humanity is bound up with the success, fulfillment, and flourishing of everyone else's. There's subsidiarity, which is basically, I'm just going to quote here, the role of individuals, families, local communities, and intermediary organizations should not be supplanted by higher level authorities. So things should be sort of localist, moving upwards. The church is not included in these high-level authorities, I believe. And then we have, Never principle is what he calls the universal destination of goods. So all of the earth's goods, soil, earth, water, natural resources are given by God to everybody, and therefore everybody has a right to use them for life. And the Pope wants to extend this to, quote, patents, algorithms, digital platforms, technological infrastructure, and data. And these all have to be used for the common good. The common good, essentially, for the most, not in this utilitarian sense of the most good to the most number of people, but for the good of the human family as such. And they do think of humans as a family. But all of this comes back to an idea of the human, which I think takes us out of the Catholic context, because it's a humanism that you can see in multiple philosophical contexts. I mean, I see it even in people like Feuerbach, who Marx is responding to. And this is the idea, and this is their term, ontological dignity. The ontological dignity. Now, I'm going to read out a quote from the encyclicals, and it's the idea that humans are, quote, created for relationship. Every human person is planned and willed by God to enter into communion with him, with others, and with creation. Human dignity does not depend on a person's abilities, wealth, or position in life, nor on the right or wrong choices made. Instead, it is a gift that precedes and transcends each person, endowed by God as an expression of his unfailing love. Now, this for me is like the philosophically most interesting part of this. Not because it's philosophically interesting, but because this is the thing which most various philosophers have affirmed without being Catholic, without being even Christian, or have taken out its Christian context to apply it generally. This is the kind of humanism you'll see in thinkers such as Feuerbach, Karl Marx. As someone who's writing a book on Stirner, this is the kind of humanism that he is really trying to criticize. And I just thought, I'll leave it. I won't get into the criticism just yet, but I want to just briefly say something about what this humanism does. It precedes us and it transcends us. Human dignity. It's not so much talking about what humans are, but what is owed to the human, what is meaningful about the human. And this is the idea that they are dignified, they have something which cannot be violated, something which is not determined by contingent circumstances, not by temporal circumstances. So every human, regardless of their qualities of their body, how they're born, any terms, disability, ability, if you want to use it in those terms, I mean, they will use it in those terms. But, rich, poor, it's St. Paul, there is neither Jew nor Greek nor slave nor free nor man nor woman. Everyone is equal in Christ. That is the kind of universalism that they are putting into this anthropological framework. And what is interesting to me about this encyclical is how many ways in which the theological is represented or reclothed in this anthropological dimension. And the church is saying that these technologies are not neutral. They require an anthropological vision to guide them. And that's where I think it gets most interesting and indeed philosophically the most problematic if you want to use this as your Butlerian jihadist banner. But I'll leave it there.
I just want to interject one thing, and I'm going to circle back to the Rerum Novarum. The current Pope's recent encyclical, I think, engenders a presupposition that was enunciated more starkly and more robustly in the Rerum Novarum. And I think we need to point that out. Adam had brushed past it, but it is the rights and duties of private property ownership as it's understood by the Pope and just in Catholicism in general. And here, I'm just pulling from the Wikipedia page on the Rerum Novarum. And it just goes on to say that despite the fact that the church might criticize things like liberalism, individualism, and unfettered capitalism, Pope Leo XIII, who wrote the Rerum Novarum, absolutely supported private property. This is an idea that's buttressed by the ideas of St. Thomas Aquinas. There are some quotes here. Leo writes in the Rerum Novarum, private ownership, as we have seen, is the natural right of man, and to exercise that right, especially as members of a society, is not only lawful, but absolutely necessary. And just to quote Thomas Aquinas, For a man to hold private property, and it is also necessary for the carrying on of human existence, whoever has received from the divine bounty a large share of temporal blessings, whether they be external and material or gifts of the mind, has received them for the purpose of using them for the perfecting of his own nature, and at the same time that he may employ them as the steward of God's providence for the benefit of others. So there is a very strong liberal idea and liberal kernel, at the very center of the critiques in scare quotes that we're about to go over today. And that's why you do not see a redress of class conflict. You do not see within the most recent encyclical a gesture towards class struggle. It's always solidarity, subsidiarity, kind of denuded of those things. And Adam, you're using the figure of Feuerbach to talk about the kind of moralizing that the Pope is doing. And I think that's a good analogy.
I think there's a moment in the most recent encyclical where they specifically say they are not talking about class struggle. Maybe I'm making that up, but at some point, Adam is nodding his head, so hopefully I'm not just hallucinating that, but they do take great pains to move in that direction while not letting there be any ambiguity whatsoever. Anyway, that's just an aside. From the perspective of digital infrastructure and the political economy of digital infrastructure, thinking about data and platforms and algorithms as a public good doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It doesn't check out at all. But it's interesting that, I guess I'm seeing a connection here. Maybe there's not much to it. Maybe there is. I'm not sure, between what Adam is saying with the vision of the human that we get and the idea of ontological dignity, and then Craig pointed out that we get this idea from Aquinas that private property is not only good, but necessary for the continuation of the human. So this document is trying to thread a lot of needles and holds many different things in tension. It has what would appear to be conflicting objectives that it's trying to sublimate into something that is Catholic, is not breaking with anything in any significant way. But it seems worth beginning to this idea that the human is at the center of this document. And as much as they are emphasizing what they think of as solidarity, what they call solidarity, social justice, etc., and obviously it's a critique of technology, a fairly superficial one, but in some sense, of course, it's that. And yet it seems to still be more reducible to an extremely liberal capitalist vision of technology than anything that we might get from a superficial reading.
No, yeah, I think this is part of the frustrating bit, because we talk about sort of the absence of class struggle. It is, again, just to listen, we're not saying like the Pope should be a Marxist because the Pope isn't Catholic. Like the overarching thesis here is the Pope is Catholic. It's just we to remind the world the Pope is Catholic. But in terms of, for example, he does say, like, at one point, the labor unions have been supported by the Catholic Church. They're not good enough to prevent these kind of job losses from large language models and stuff. But we need to be in dialogue with them. It's focused on dialogue in society with the church as a mediator. And you can see, as you said, with this liberal presupposition where the absence of conflict is there, because this encyclical was announced with the head of Anthropic, Chris Olah, a field-funded AI playboy who was basically sort of doing his sort of jump onto the other theological side of the politics of so-called AI. We have Thiel thinks that the Pope isn't Catholic because Thiel is, sort of a right-wing sort of trad-calf Protestant, basically. But he identifies as Catholic, and we have Chris Olah sort of jumping to the other side and he's returning to this different kind of sort of AI scaremongering, than Teal, because Teal's whole thing is scaremongering is if we prevent AI from doing this and that, then it's the Antichrist. Whereas Olar is going back to sort of the Sam Altman style of AI scaremongering, which is, this is a dangerous technology, therefore you should let me and my friends who are the moral arbiters of this technology and are guided by the Pope to have complete control over it. Now, this is not something that Chris Olar has come up with himself. Pope Francis sent envoys to talk to people like Altman and Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO. This is something that's kind of been on the cards for a while. This isn't quite new, but I do think there's a mutual benefit there, because Leo XIV gets to live up to his namesake because he gets to talk about the Navarum. And then in doing so, he gets to do a little bit of reification of the rerum. So he can say AI he demystifies it, but also in fact, he has to speak on it with Anthropic as a danger, still participates in its reification because he mystifies it, but also by sustaining the image at the same time, which is something that, that is what they're quite good at. That is kind of the entire thing, sustaining the image and the mystery at the same time, making it palpable through imagery, whilst also, being part of a religion that has an explicit prohibition on graven images. This is the dance. This is the dialectic. And I think the vision of the human in this is completely compatible. And I think, especially with private property, because in some ways, I can't help but think that who's the property owner of your dignity? Do you own your own dignity? No, you do not as a human. Who owns your dignity? God. Who is the vicar of God? Vicarious, the vicar of Christ. That's the church. Now, people might think this is bad faith, but I just think I want to go to a previous encyclical by Pope Francis, who people generally have a lot of good opinions of. And I'm just going to quote, this is from an encyclical called Dignitas Infinita by Pope Francis. This is a quote: "The dignity of the body cannot be considered inferior to that of the person as such. The Catechism of the Catholic Church expressly invites us to recognize that, quote, the human body shares in the dignity of the image of God. Such a truth deserves to be remembered, especially when it comes to sex change, for humans are inseparably composed of both body and soul." Going forward, "The body participates in that dignity as it is endowed with personal meanings, particularly in its sexed condition." And I think this is part of the real double bind of this kind of strand of humanism, because it allows you to metaphysically define the contours of humanity in terms of personality, which is based on, in this case, empirically derived factors such as sexuation. And then when you say that it, as I said before, it precedes and transcends, you then put them at either side of history. In the Alpha and the Omega, you say this is transhistorical, and yet as the church we are guiding you towards completing this vision at the end of history. You introduce this double bind between the essence of the human and its appearance in the individual human, which they can violate and cultivate, but only in terms that are not decidable by them. And I think this distinction between essence and appearance in this kind of humanist model comes into an exact manifestation, an exact dialectical manifestation in how this encyclical by Leo XIV talks about human rights, and particularly the right to life, and particularly the right to life, as he says in this, from conception. Pope is Catholic, he's anti-abortion. We shouldn't be surprised at that, but people occasionally need to be reminded. And I think this kind of humanism, this dynamic between the essence of human personality and its appearance in historical time, appears, for example, in this division in the body of the pregnant person, because then you have a humanity that is posited within them to the detriment of the actual human person there, in favor of the abstract humanity that is posited within them by this anthropological and metaphysical approach to the anthropological discourse as such. And I think this is Stirner is a very good person at pointing this out. He says, the thing about humanists is that they posit a humanity in you, and they'll dehumanize the fuck out of you to preserve the inner humanity. Dehumanization and dehumanization are dialectical corollaries. If you don't want to follow Stirner on this, look at, go back to our episode on Aimé Césaire's discourse on colonialism. It's exactly the same kind of humanism that he's positing. And this is where I think this is just not a good way to critique AI, because it reintroduces this dialectic of humanization. It also reintroduces the dialectic of dehumanization. Another example of this, I just quoted it, was Pope Francis, the guy who everyone loved, on sexual reassignment surgery. American Association of Catholic Bishops are currently strangling, trans kids' healthcare in the US, and I think this is not simply, going the wrong way. I think this is a direct corollary to the structure of anthropological humanism that is present in this encyclical. Now, I'm saying that Pope wants this to happen, but he sure as hell isn't fucking stopping it, is he? We should be a bit more critical of this, not because we want to be the heretical Catholics if we are Catholics, or want to be Martin Luther, but insofar as these do spread out in terms of people looking for moral leadership, I do think a bit of the old ruthless criticism of all that exists comes in. And as someone who's been doing young Hegelianism for about 6 years, finally there's a use for it. I'm sorry if that was too long.
Yeah, just a one-off observation. I don't think there's much to be made of this, actually, but something just jumped out at me, which is that in a very different way, what Adam describes as the sacrificing of an actual person's needs. For example, somebody wishing to terminate a pregnancy, or a trans person, the sacrificing of their personhood for an abstract notion of whatever the human is what's going on with AI right now. Kind of what's always been going on with AI. AI from the start was conceptualized as a research agenda to fabricate signs of human cognition in digital computing machines. So it was always about something to do with some notion of human. Up until recently, I don't think this was really a widespread problem per se. But after the generative age emerged, and we can call it maybe December 2022, which is when GPT came out, or the year before that with the image generating AIs, we get an image of a human inscribed in these technologies. Very abstract, has nothing to do, as far as I'm concerned, with what constitutes a person. I kind of prefer personhood, at least these days, as a framework over the human, but that would be another aside. So we get an image of the human inscribed in these technologies. I don't think it has very much to do with what makes a person, or with what makes a sentient being entitled to certain rights, or at least constituted by something that has agency and dignity and, all of these concepts. And we are sacrificing our concrete personhood in the name of this abstract humanness. And there is a theological and metaphysical rhetoric around it. Again, I don't know if there's very much to be made of that, but at least to me, it's an interesting rhyme right there. And it has it's related to why I think this is an incredibly bad way to criticize AI.
I just want to ask a question, Emma, just because I know you're working on this upcoming class on anti-sort of civilizational thought. I mean, how do you think they relate? I mean, what's their kind of approach, like political or theological, to kind of technology? I mean, do you think there's anything similar to like what the Pope gets wrong here about the critique of technology that they might do in terms of, do they end up being quite humanistic in a similar way?
I think it depends on what thinker you're addressing. I see anti-civ as lacking internal consistency in every possible way. So there's not a lot of metaphysical, epistemic, ontological, let alone when it comes to conceptualizations of the human. But I will say that a lot of it comes from the 70s eco-philosophy. There are a number of anti-civ adjacent feminist eco-philosophers, even today, decades after feminist eco-philosophy at its moment, where there are essentialist notions of what it means to be in accordance with life or out of accordance with life that I find incredibly unsatisfying and in some applications quite troubling. There's a sort of right to life ethos that is compatible with an anti-abortion stance. And in fact, there are eco-philosophers and feminist thinkers who take an anti-abortion stance. And an uncritical examination of life as such that can also be used to underwrite eco-fascism. It's definitely there. And so, this is all stuff that we'll get into in the course, but, I don't want to speak on behalf of anti-civ as an entire movement because it's never seen itself sort of that way. I guess I would end with saying you could certainly be a Catholic anti-civ thinker and subscribe to some very traditionalist, non-interpretive Catholic notions, and read this and see it as harmonious with all of your beliefs as you retreat from society and nibble your vegetables and scowl at the urban intellectuals.
As I was both reading the encyclical and I did a couple of other videos on it, and I watched the video, what was it? It was the launch of the encyclical, of course, where there is essentially a panel consisting of cardinals, Ola, the Pope himself, and some other worldly scholars, it seems. And all of that was pure spectacle. I will get to that later. But one of the things that kept coming to mind as I was going through all of this, and Adam already brushed past it, is the notion of a double bind. And I was led to think of the concept of the double pincer as we see it in 1,000 Plateaus. And particularly the spectacle at the launch event was its own kind of, I guess you would say, mise en scène of this double pincher. And here's my radical claim about this whole thing. This encyclical didn't have to be about AI. AI, in some sense, is almost secondary in all of this. I think there's a larger framing here where we can replace AI with a notion of capital and technology forming a larger apparatus of capture, and the presumption and presupposition and moral legitimacy of that apparatus, and how the whole Just another reminder to our Patreon supporters, you can catch the rest of this discussion on Patreon as a Patreon exclusive. So navigate to the show notes and find our Patreon account where you can subscribe. Okay, we'll see you there.